Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this panel. I believe it's the last panel of the afternoon, last but not least by any means. Our topic for today is African American missions history, research, and teaching methods. I'm Laurie Maffly-Kipp from Washington University in St. Louis, and my job today is to introduce our speakers and to give a little housekeeping before we get started. So this panel today analyzes the significance and the legacies of African American mission work by explaining how more recent developments in this field influence our curriculum and our research agendas. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to say that they're each going to speak for 5 to 8 minutes. So we're trying to keep the introductory talk to a minimum and then open it up to questions from the audience so that we can get a robust discussion going. I would ask when we get to that point that rather than using the chat function, you use the Q&A, and I will be moderating that and making sure that the questions get addressed. So to start out, I want to first introduce Wendy Urban-Mead from Bard College. Wendy is the Associate Professor of History at Bard College, where she teaches history on both on campus and for the Bard Prison Initiative. She is also core faculty in the Master of Arts in Teaching program. Her research interests include gender and religion in Southern Africa, as well as empire and the Great War. She's the author of The Gender of Piety, Family, Faith, and Colonial Rule in Matabeleland, Zimbabwe. I knew I'd mess that up, Wendy. I hope I got it close to right. And today she'll be discussing a seminar she teaches called Schooling in Colonial Africa. After reading a particularly interesting research paper by one of her students on schools run by African American missionaries in Africa, she'll address how the course and its readings prepared the student to shape and pursue this issue, and conclude with how this experience will shape her own teaching of the class in the future. Next, we'll hear from Ann Vaughn Cross, a historian in the Department of Geography and Sociology at Samford University, who teaches primarily in the interdisciplinary core curriculum. Her articles about missions history have appeared in such publications as Social Sciences and Missions and North American Foreign Missions, 1810 to 1914. Theology, Theory, and Policy, edited by Wilbert Schenck. Her current manuscript analyzes the intersection of sex, race, and missions mythologies in the history of the Southern Baptist Convention. And today she'll be discussing how Kimberly Hill's new book, A Higher Mission, informs the ongoing process of decentering whiteness in narratives of Christianity and missions, and using concepts from memory studies, articulate how she attempts to help students at a predominantly white religious institution in the legacy Bible Belt to deconstruct and remember the history that has shaped them already and the history they have yet to discover. And then we will hear from Kimberly Hill herself, an assistant professor of US history at the University of Texas at Dallas. She specializes in researching early 20th century church history and Black internationalism. Her first book, A Higher Mission, analyzes these topics through the educational initiatives of African American Presbyterian missionaries to Central Africa. Professor Hill will discuss 2 ways that she incorporates lessons from her research into courses that do not focus on missions history. She will describe using origin stories and international archival sources to make introductory US history courses more engaging and inclusive. Then we'll be hearing from Christina C. Davidson, who is a postdoctoral research associate at the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis, and happily my colleague for this year. Her research explores the intersection of race, religion, and empire in the Americas. Her book manuscript, tentatively entitled Converting Hispaniola, Religious Race-Making in the Dominican Americas, examines racialized moral discourses in the diplomatic and cultural relations between the United States and Dominican Republic. Today, Dr. Davidson will discuss her research on AME church history in the Caribbean and Caribbean AME missionaries' perspectives on that historical African-American religious institution. And finally, we will be hearing from Dave Datema, who is a fourth-year PhD student at Fuller Theological Seminary's Center for Missiological Research. He is studying the lives of African-American missionaries Joseph and Mary Gomer, who served with the Church of the United Brethren in Christ in Sierra Leone, West Africa, from 1872 to 1894. He also serves as missiology catalyst for Frontier Ventures, formerly the U.S. Center for World Mission, and has published numerous articles on the topic of people groups. Currently, he is revising an article for the journal Missiology, an International Review. Using his forthcoming dissertation subjects, Joseph and Mary Gomer, as a lens, he will discuss their work in Sierra Leone and place it within the broader 19th century context. He'll be describing the ways that sentiments of civilization and religion were appropriated within Black nationalism, with a focus on the different models of Black nationalism current in the 19th century. So with that, I will turn it over to Wendy to get us started. And please remember to use the Q&A. And again, you can put your questions in there anytime and we'll start answering them later on. Wendy?
Thank you, Laurie. And thank you, Kim, for organizing us and kind of inspiring us to come together at this for this roundtable. I'm happy to be part of it. So as Laurie said, I'm my religion-related research originally was on Southern Africa, and my monograph and a lot of my research has been on the Church of the history of the Brethren in Christ Church in Zimbabwe. And yet when I got my position at Bard, I was tasked with creating a kind of global history curriculum for teaching candidates who are going to go out and teach in mostly New York State public schools. So there was no overt mandate for me to be teaching about religious history at all in my course developments over the years. But certainly I was teaching courses on historiography and global revolution, and I developed a course recently on the Great War in global perspective. But I was yearning to somehow incorporate the materials that I had been working with for all this time through my research in a way that was faithful to the teaching that I was asked to do by my institution. So I ended up developing this course for the first time in 2016 originally called Education in Colonial Africa. After I'd been teaching it for a few weeks, I realized I should have called it Schooling in Colonial Africa, and I've renamed it since then. The first version of it was designed for advanced undergraduates, mostly history majors, and for Master of Arts in Teaching candidates who were preparing to become secondary school teachers. And the course did not have a church history angle at all in its advertising or description. The course on schooling, formal schooling in colonial Africa, mostly worked with materials from the British colonial world, notably South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Kenya. However, if you know anything about British colonial Africa, you know that most of the schools were run by missions. And so we ended up backing into giving the students an introduction to what missionaries were doing and why they were there, and how schools figured in their understanding of what their work was, and how it both dovetailed and conflicted with British colonial policies and aims. And while I was preparing the reading list for this first version of the course, I realized it would be good for students to learn more about the Phelps-Stokes Fund and the cross-fertilization between educational efforts to reach formerly enslaved African Americans in the American South in the second half of the 19th century, and the push to create an emphasis on so-called industrial schooling in the schools of South Africa and Kenya, and in British colonial Africa more generally in the early 20th century. I was feeling my way on this at that point in time, and I wasn't able to pursue richly this line of connection from Hampton Institute and Tuskegee into the work of African American missionaries in Africa. But the groundwork is there because the Phelps-Stokes work is a node where these things all do connect. And so I kind of just realized as I was teaching it through the first time that this was something I needed to do more with next time through. Basically the first time I taught this course, there was no mention or readings about African American missionaries, and it really didn't come up at all. We did lots of really interesting things that semester. And if you're interested, during the Q&A, I can give you an overview of some of the readings that we did do. I taught this course a second time 4 years later, which is fall of 2019, 4 years later, and redesigned it to be more of a research seminar that foregrounded student engagement with primary materials. So we spent a lot of time scaffolding the steps toward putting together a research question and engaging with secondary and primary materials so the student could write an original paper relating to formal schooling in colonial Africa. One of the students in this course was named Melissa, and I just spoke to her yesterday, as a matter of fact, because she's now training to be a teacher and she's now one of my student teachers. And I asked her permission if I could use her name, and she said yes. She's excited that she's going to be famous with all of you today. She asked me early on in the semester, because people were having to cast about rather early for a paper topic and to start diving and looking for primary materials. She said, were there any African Americans involved in mission work in Africa? I said, yes, absolutely. I didn't know a lot about it, except for having seen The Color Purple many, many years prior. And I was aware of the connection between Columbia University's Teachers College and Oberlin and South African intellectuals who had founded schools in South Africa. I also knew about William Shepherd's work with the Presbyterian Church in Congo, mainly from having read King Leopold's Ghost. So I started her there with King Leopold's Ghost to read Hochschild's footnotes for clues as to where she might find primary materials on Shepherd's work in Congo, and whether that mission ran any schools. In the meantime, one of her classmates became very interested in Germany's cotton cultivation policies for his paper topic. And the course involved a lot of peer review of each other's work at every stage of the game. So as these two worked together in peer evaluation of their paper drafts, Melissa ended up learning about this fascinating connection between the Tuskegee Institute and Germany's cotton schemes in West Africa and the colony of Togo. She ended up, in the end, writing a very interesting paper considering both Shepherd's endeavors in Congo, which did not really involve many schools as far as she could tell, and the Tuskegee men trying to get cotton to grow in Togo, including establishing a so-called cotton school. And this sentence from Melissa's paper illustrates how students in this very overtly, sort of like by its packaging, secular course came to realize that colonial Africa's schooling was often inextricably linked with missions history. Quote her paper, Shepherd graduated from Hampton in the mid-1880s and later moved to Alabama to study for the ministry at Tuscaloosa Theological Institute. As we know, Christianity was central for Hampton and Washington and was used as the main motivation for uplift work. And for a student such as herself, it was quite a long path for her to even be able to make that statement. So really interesting to watch her levels of understanding grow. I can tell you more about her paper and the sources she used in the Q&A if you'd like. The third time I taught this course, I redesigned it to be a second-year college student course with a writing intensive emphasis, not research, but just sort of like more introductory college writing skills for the Bard Prison Initiative. In this case, my students then were incarcerated men who were liberal arts sophomores who happened to be in a maximum security prison. In that version of the course, we were going to spend more time with each case study since we didn't have to rev up for a research paper. So I was including, so because I had been already alert to all of this, thanks to Melissa and her classmate Marco, I included an old article from 1970 by KJ King called The African American Missionary, or The American Negro as Missionary to East Africa. And it ended up being a very good companion piece that quite a few students opted to read as they were working up a historical context for, thank you, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's memoir, Dreams in a Time of War. And then I can tell you how I ended up using stuff by Robert Vinson's research on the American and African American connection with South Africa in a new course that I taught this year. And in the future, I want to do more with Phelps Stokes. I want to read Kim Hill's book, which our library just bought upon my request, and find ways for students to access and work with primary materials on schools run by African Americans in colonial Africa or that they taught in as much as possible, particularly since one of the things I really want to be doing is developing global understandings, and these kinds of intersections are innately global. And it also ends, all of this material ends up backing me into some very interesting intersections with my work on Africa and World War I, which someone can ask me about if they're interested. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Wendy. Carol Ann, turn on your Yeah, your audio.
Apologies. Do you hear me now? Thank you, Laurie, for your moderation. And I want to thank and congratulate Dr. Kimberly Hill for your important book that we celebrate today. I'm grateful to get to participate in this discussion and what missions history means to our discipline and what our discipline means to society. I teach at a predominantly white religious institution located and shaped by the Legacy Bible Belt in the southern United States. Most of our students bring with them experiences, assumptions, and perhaps trauma shaped by that culture. My research focuses on the continuity of the three founding pylons of the 1845 Southern Baptist Convention. And these three strands' resilience and reinforcement of each other whenever one strand is loosened. White supremacy and racialized paternalism, male supremacy and gendered paternalism, and thirdly, denominational exceptionalism and hubris that is based on a particular missions mythology for identity. In a denomination of such loosely bound individual congregations as Southern Baptists, it was their missions mythology that provided the ideological and tangible or financial thread for existence. Therefore, becoming the largest Protestant denomination in the US due to their missions and their stories they told themselves and others that no one does missions quite like this, means that truth seeking and truth telling about the mission's history and mythology and those three-stranded through lines to the present compose an existential threat and offer obstacles and opportunities for current students' understanding of Christianity and history and the future. The integrality of African American missionaries to American history and global Christianity is clear, as well as is their marginalization from generations of narratives by white historians, including those who trained me and including myself. Additionally, abusive treatment of the complexities and nuances and ironies in missions history have often served institutions' conservative alchemy to preserve the hermeneutic of hierarchy regarding sex, ethnicity, and self-reverential Christianity. My institution in Birmingham, Alabama, bears the scars of being known as Birmingham, the city, and is also the location of the Shepherd and Lapsley Presbytery, who sponsored Alonzo and Althea Brown Edmiston, Mariah Fearing, and other African-American missionaries in the postbellum and Jim Crow era. This is one of many reasons why I welcome Dr. Hill's book, A Higher Mission, which is worthy of its dedication to the memories of Sylvia Jacobs and Lamine Sene. Hill's joint biography of a male and female missionary is neither hagiography nor a motography. It models the craft of recovering and portraying the personhood of her subjects who are navigating what Hill titles the perimeter of two freedom struggles in this comparative study of the US and Congo. Hill gives us a set of pedagogical opportunities to re-explore the very concepts of education, as well as education as ministry strategies. She upends the overly simplistic binary categories often used for industrial and agricultural education versus traditional classical Western education, as they're called. And she demonstrates their complementarity and adaptability. As higher mission centers, how alumni of historically Black colleges and universities transformed their academic preparation, which differed from each other, into innovative ministry strategies. I happened to read A Higher Mission at the time I was teaching from Nathan Cardin's A Dream of the Future, Race, Empire, and Modernity at the Atlanta and Nashville World's Fair. And they pair well in helping students see the changing dynamics of organizations and institutions in this era. Dr. Hill's command of the complexities of personalities and professional relationships offer some surprises to our 21st century sensibilities. What did it mean, for example, for African-American missionaries to be agents of imperialism, especially in their experiences and their goals for themselves, for their students, ideas about manual labor, missions uplift, corporal punishment, self-sufficiency, and sense of community? Hill carefully crafts these contours and gives us more than stories and amber well told. In addition, her engagement with the public through podcasts and interviews, such as a great one with Jesse Curtis, are great to use with our students. So I'd like to talk about my classes at this point. The courses I teach at Samford are pre-disciplinary as much as interdisciplinary because they're almost always in the first year of the core curriculum. In our course seminars, we teach research and writing from our own areas of expertise. So my students work in some capacity on sex, race, and religion, and in this semester, biography, because I think we need some good company. The core text class originated as a cultural perspectives course in the 1990s, but about a decade ago, our administration turned it into more traditional Western great books. But we individual faculty are free to interrogate that tradition as much as celebrate it. The white savior complex remains strong among our white evangelical students. And one of the most engaging texts that I assign across the curriculum is Tamara Lewis's Wherefore She Made Suit, African Women's Religious and Spiritual Determinism in 16th and 17th century England, which Dr. Lewis presented at this conference about 2 years ago. Around 2019, I began introducing students to Michael Rothberg's concept of the implicated subject, beyond victims and perpetrators, about the ways we all have inherited history and are implicated in the present and in what we give to the future. I try to integrate this with some very basic tools from autoethnography and reflection, shaped by Dr. Angela Sims's work regarding Christianity. Sometimes this is as basic as a SWOT of strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for students' subjects, as well as for themselves, and their response to their own group's history and mythology. Foregrounding this work with some intellectual and spiritual virtue tools can be useful. A colleague in our psychology department recommended the virtue and character strengths assessment that students can access online for free, and this provides a shared vocabulary and reference tool throughout the semester as students consider where they see evidence of character strengths or lack thereof in their subject's specific context and challenges. And students can see easily how virtues are gendered and racialized if we give them the space and the time to discuss it. I've found that many of my white students come to recognize the need for a deeper dive into the humility studies being done by our colleagues in social psychology. When my students analyze the 1851 Southern Baptist document, Duties of Masters to Servants or Slaves, therefore, there are always some students still confused by what's wrong with it, a revealing indictment of the miseducation of so many white Americans. And some have confided what their family members say to them when they find them reading Ida B. Wells' Southern Horrors. I won't repeat those comments, but they demonstrate to the students perhaps better than I can what is at stake. So I introduced them to my taxonomy of 4 types of white women in Southern Baptist history so they can see the valorization of paternalism rather than a hermeneutics and practice of full equality, which I sometimes call the hunting for unicorns in that history. I frequently teach Harper Lee's Go Set a Watchman because it tracks so many intersectional issues, including religious and political ones, specifically inside the head of a 25-year-old white woman who's developmentally delayed in her understanding of reality or resilience in handling it. And it requires and allows a lot of teaching about the context of what is and is not in the text, including the kind of white-centered curriculum in which students are reading the book itself and ways in which they may have been educated to be little watchmen of white supremacy and patriarchal religion, or cooperate with it and become implicated subjects with it. And at that point, students are eager to address those blind spots and desire more work and are eager to study books like A Higher Mission. Last September, all of my classes and I participated in the Scholars Strike for Racial Justice, organized by Dr. Butler. And on that occasion, we didn't pause as much as reiterate specific ways we in our classes at a place like Samford are implicated subjects in racial injustice and the work for justice, particularly in Christianity itself. And so in conclusion, I want to thank all of you for your work and the exciting scholarship this year. And I hope that this organization will continue to foster and platform the leading edges of knowledge of all of church history in sustainable ways. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol Ann, so much. Kim, now we'll turn it over to you. Get your sound on. Can you? There you go.
Thank you very much. I am very happy to finally be here with my colleagues talking about this topic that's so close to my heart. During my first years of planning what became my book on Black Presbyterian missionaries, I taught introductory courses at a community college. And that teaching load forced me to reconsider the scope and practicality of my research interest by making connections across centuries. So I'd like to introduce two ways that I continue to incorporate missions research into my US history to 1865 classes. The first approach emphasizes origin stories to promote analysis, and the second approach sparks discussion with a diverse range of primary sources. These strategies are worth considering because History 1301 and 1302, as they're called at my institution, these core courses have been identified as among the courses most likely to encourage students to abandon higher education. By introducing students to competing narratives and international material, I hope to keep them intrigued enough to enroll in other history courses. And I think this morning's panel on situating religious diversity in the US history curriculum, because of the work that they've already done to encourage us to consider this topic. Regarding origin stories, missions research has taught me to trace the beginning and end of major events without adhering to typical chronologies. The work of folklorists and anthropologists helped me notice the significance of a story that African villagers told Congo missionary Alonzo Edmiston in 1916. These villagers described Edmiston's sons as being accompanied by the spirits of other villagers who died many years earlier. And because the missionaries' sons were born in Central Africa, their eventual return to the continent was considered a foregone conclusion. But more than that, they were expected to also bring back the spirits that traveled across the Atlantic with them. I recognize this story now as a way of placing the Edmistons and other African-American missionaries in a timeline that predates their individual appointments to church work and extends beyond the deaths of everyone involved. By blurring the lines between the physical and spiritual worlds, the African storytellers distracted Alonzo Edmiston from his worries about his family's travels, and they also offered him hope for a distant yet happy ending. I don't tell that specific story in the survey classes, but I do suggest how such aspects of African traditional religion can influence historical narratives about the transatlantic slave trade. US history textbook accounts tend to focus on the dehumanizing and deadly consequences of the Middle Passage, while naming one or two survivors who found recognition in the English-speaking world. African folklore taught me to include perspectives that recognize the familial connections of each person kidnapped through the trade by linking them to later generations and by committing their legacies back to the African continent. For examples of those kind of perspectives that you could use in your own courses, I recommend incorporating Laurie Maffly-Kipp's Setting Down the Sacred Past and other histories of African-American expatriates who were involved with the American Colonization Society. The topic of origin stories also motivated me to reorganize the History 1301 course overall. Since 2016, I've taught most of the first month of the survey course backwards. After an initial week comparing Native American creation stories, I asked the students to consider the American Thanksgiving tale as a national creation story that communicates shared ideals. The following lectures and assignments encourage them to compare or contrast the argument of the Thanksgiving tale with the goals communicated in documents by New England Puritans, by Virginia planters, or by Spanish explorers. My strategy is to help students recognize competing interpretations of a similar time period. And that recognition comes easier when I acknowledge their tendency to think of all British settlers as pilgrims and their tendency to think of early American history as starting with Thanksgiving. The more that students notice how various groups envision life on this continent differently, the more likely these students are to accept that historical narratives shape our recognition of historic facts. Skipping ahead in the course chronology, I suggest broadening the range of primary sources for lessons about manifest destiny. My own research draws heavily from the collections of the Presbyterian Historical Society, which include hundreds of photographs taken by Congo Mission co-founder William Henry Shepherd, who was already mentioned by Wendy Urban-Mead. I've shown students a photograph of Shepherd in his white suit and his plinth helmet posing with African warriors and their spears. Though the photo dates from around 1900, it's useful for prompting questions about the symbols and legacies of US expansionism. For example, did the visual contrast between this Black missionary and the African men indicate that Shepherd represented the potential for Western culture to influence this continent? And how much was Shepherd's career as an explorer influenced by the types of racial stereotypes expressed in the Southern Manifest Destiny campaigns of the mid-1800s? The American Yop Reader is one of the free online resources available to help diversify the selection of primary sources in a history course. And it was co-edited by one of my colleagues here, Dr. Benjamin Wright. The Manifest Destiny chapter in American Yop includes documents from the Cherokee Nation, from a member of the Wyandot tribe, from a Chinese gold miner, and from a Venezuelan general. Each one complicates the depiction of a nation spreading from sea to shining sea as being inevitable or harmonious. These sources also help students notice intersectionality in historical topics through the influence of pro-slavery thought and the development of racism beyond Black-white dichotomies. To fit the global theme of my own course, I also use a Japanese painting of US Commodore Matthew Perry shortly after his warship forced Japan to open its borders to international trade in the 1850s. Teaching about this military venture is another way that I use a missiological approach without mentioning African-American missionaries explicitly. My goal is to normalize students' interactions with primary sources that originated in ethnicities and locations beyond their own. And the process forces them to give up expectations that they or anyone know all that there is to know about American history. The Congo missionaries I studied developed empathetic and innovative ideas based on their commitment to listen to additional perspectives. And I believe that attention to diverse sources and stories can help history students improve their work too. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim. That was great. Okay, Christina.
Hi, everyone. I'm Christina Davidson, and I just wanted to take a moment to thank the conference organizers as well as Dr. Kim Hill. Thank you so much for inviting me and including me on this panel. So my work has mostly focused on the African Methodist Episcopal Church and its foreign missions. And when we think about AME missions, we typically think about missions on the continent of Africa. We could think about James Campbell's work on South Africa, more recent scholarship by Elizabeth Ingle on West Africa. And in my research, I have shifted the focus to the Caribbean and Latin America. And so I've argued elsewhere that the Caribbean, particularly the island of Hispaniola, represented the first foreign missionary site for the AME Church after the US Civil War, even while the continent of Africa remained in the thoughts and hearts of AME leaders. And so what does it look like to think about the Caribbean as the base for AME missions, and what does that teach us? Certainly, it elucidates many of the problems that missionaries in Africa, particularly African-born preachers and ministers, would later face in the 1890s and early 20th century. But it also demonstrates continuities of Caribbean Protestant networks that connected the islands to each other and to the North American mainland. And so with that kind of broader perspective in mind, I just wanted to include a short anecdote about one minister who's come up in my research, N.B. Stewart, as an example. So in the fall of 1884, one Reverend N.B. Stewart, a Black minister from the British Caribbean, visited the Northeast United States, where he spoke to members of the African Methodist Episcopal Church about the congregations he led in British Guiana and Trinidad. He ran 2 circuits, one in Georgetown, the other on the west coast of British Guiana, and then a small missionary station in Dutch Guiana. He had 2 missionary assistants, Reverend J.E. Shepherd and G.S. Martin, who took over the congregations when he traveled. And he described having a Sabbath school and 2 day schools in Georgetown, 2 day schools and 3 Sabbath schools on the West Coast. According to him, he also, there was a village on the West Coast of British Guiana that had recently built the church. And it's likely that all of this work was funded locally, and is also likely that he was in the Northeast to try to get some money, although I don't know why exactly he was there. What I do know is that Stewart at this time was a minister not of the AME Church, but of the British Methodist Episcopal Church. This denomination, the BME, had once been part of the AME Church and was founded by AMEs who had immigrated to Canada. The BMEs broke from the AME due to difficulties caused by the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act. And so now, about 30 plus years later, the BME was on the precipice of a reunion with the AME Church. And Stewart, who led these 2 or 3 BME missionary congregations in British Guiana, was a fan of this reunion. He believed that the merger demonstrated the AME Church's heartfelt love and courage and would lead to the elevation of our caste in the Caribbean and in South America. And so here we see, ideas of racial uplift that were very popular, right, with African Americans at the time. And, this is all well and good, right? It aligns with what we know of the period. Yet his experiences traveling the Caribbean just a year later in 1885 tell another story, one in which Afro-Caribbean ministers and lay preachers became connected to each other, not only because of their beliefs in racial uplift, but also because of their collective experiences as Afro-Caribbean ministers, right, as this ethnic group, differentiated from African Americans in the United States. So almost a year later, in December 1885, Stewart boarded a boat in British Guiana headed towards St. Thomas. By this time, the BME and AME union had passed, and all Caribbean BME congregations had transferred to the AME denomination. And so he was headed to St. Thomas because there the AME Church was sending bishops and they were going to host their first annual conference. And so this was his plan, but his boat got blown way off course. And after days of, sailing freely around the Caribbean, he ends up at Port Royal, Jamaica. And in Jamaica, he ends up, he's penniless, so he preaches in a number of churches, receives, some money from that. And there he makes friends with some of the local ministers or young people who are interested in, as he says, who have applied to be taken into the AME ministry. And then he has this proposal. He suggests that one Reverend Miller, a minister of the Philadelphia Conference and a native of Jamaica, was the best man to lead this potential Jamaican mission. The AME Church didn't yet exist in Jamaica at the time. He says, quote, probably he may yet be able to meet the approbation of his people and maybe the instrument in doing some good for the church in Jamaica. And then he also proposes that this proposed Jamaican church come under Haiti as part of the Haitian circuit. And so from Jamaica, Stewart goes to Haiti. And when he's in Haiti, he comes across 2 Haitian ministers who are working on behalf of the AME Church, Samuel G. Dorse and Adolphus Meves, who were trained at Wilberforce in Ohio. And some of you might be familiar with the name Charles Moselle, who was the first paid missionary stationed in an African American who was stationed in Port-au-Prince. Well, he's since left. This is 1885, and he's gone. He and his wife went back to the United States, and so it's really these two Haitian ministers who are heading up the AME Church's mission in Port-au-Prince. And Mevs joins them. He preaches in the church and he talks with them, and it's there really where he's able to kind of realize that, hey, there's actually something quite different about what's going on here. Mevs and Doris haven't heard from AME leaders in the United States in quite a while. In fact, Mevs he writes and he critiques the AME Church, saying appeals upon appeals are being made in behalf of Africa, while Haiti and Santo Domingo are neglected. Doris also compares his experiences in Haiti to work being done in other Caribbean islands based off of Stewart's account. And he writes, quote, "Is it not sad and astonishing to hear that during the whole year of 1885, no tracts, no books, no church papers, and no money was sent to Brother Stewart?" And of Haiti, he reports that if our dear and sympathetic friend, Bishop Holly, did not receive regularly and lend me sometimes the New York Freeman, I would be more ignorant than I am concerning our church. And so this basically is showing that, these ministers are coming together and they're complaining about not receiving money, but in the process, they're creating these solidarities. And so I see that I only have a minute left, so I'm going to try to sum it up really quickly. But basically what ends up happening is that the Mevs family goes to Santo Domingo. They end up staying in the Dominican Republic for a while, and then Adolphus Mevs ends up in Bermuda, and then he ends up in Arkansas. I'm not exactly sure what happens to N.B. Stewart, but at the same time that Adolphus Mevs heads off to the Dominican Republic, Stewart goes to St. Thomas. In St. Thomas, there's another minister, Herbert Miller, who has ties to the Dominican Republic. And by 1889, congregations in Haiti, St. Thomas, Santo Domingo, and British Guiana are all threatening to withdraw from the AME denomination. And so there's various outcomes, some of them withdraw, some of these missions have to restart. And so I kind of think about the AME Church's Caribbean missions at this time as like fits and starts. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is to think about these Caribbean networks and Protestant networks as continuities, that these ministers are connected one to another, and the sorts of discourses that they are kind of thinking through and creating. And some of that we can also see later in comparative cases in Africa. But it also allows for the possibilities of Caribbean African solidarities. And by way of method, one of the things I'm really trying to push people towards is to think about AME or African American church history, right, from the perspectives of ministers who are creating these networks. And that really requires, sources from abroad, going to archives, going to these places and really picking out, where are the little bits and strands of pieces that we can piece together a story such as N.B. Stewart's. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Okay, Dave.
Thank you. I am going to attempt to share my screen with all of you. And can you let me know if you can see that? Is that good? I want to thank Dr. Kimberly Hill for inviting me. I approached her some time back, and I don't even remember what I was asking her about, and she's just been so gracious. I've been a member of this society now, I think, for 3 days, and so I feel very honored to be on the coattails of these great scholars. I want to talk today about a specific missionary couple. Joseph Gomer's diverse life and ministry took place within the confines of the 19th century. Born free in Ann Arbor, Michigan, raised near Battle Creek, he moved to Chicago when he was 16, where he was converted and learned the carpentry trade. He later served as a cook in the Civil War. After the war, on his return to the Midwest up the Mississippi River, he befriended a widow named Mary Green, about 10 to 15 years his senior. After marrying and settling in Dayton, Ohio, the Gomers went as missionaries to Sierra Leone, West Africa, under the auspices of a largely white denomination, the Church of the United Brethren in Christ. This is not the Church of the Brethren, and this is not the Brethren in Christ. This paper seeks to answer the question of what motivated Gomer to be a missionary to Africa. As a free Black man with very limited education, who or what informed his understanding of mission? And I'm focusing on Joseph in this presentation more than Mary, because so far I found so much more information about him. The thesis of this paper is that Gomer was substantially motivated and sustained by ideas about God and humankind that were a reflection and assimilation of the evolutionary threads of civilization and religion. And so civilization being kind of a catch-all, and politics, economics, and religion being subsets of that. But I only focus in this presentation on this civilization thread and the religion thread. And I'll come back to this. I attempt to trace the diffusion of these evolutionary threads of civilization and religion through the British, Anglo-American, and African-American contexts in the 19th century. There was appropriation, reinvention, and new creation happening during this diffusion process, resulting in areas of continuity and discontinuity. This presentation is focused on the areas of continuity, and we could have a whole other presentation on areas of discontinuity. Together, these contexts represent Gomer's cultural landscape, the mental space from which Gomer was motivated to serve and live as a missionary in Africa. And I'll just put this back up. When British missionaries sailed for Africa, they were not just going as heralds of the gospel, but as citizens of a higher civilization, superior in every way to the recipients of their benevolence. And they brought with them not just a superior form of religion, but advanced forms of politics and economics as well, with clear plans on how to kickstart the evolutionary process in the African context. For British evangelicals, the Christianization of Africa was first and foremost a transformation of the person. Secondly, it was a replacement of the culture. The Victorian missionary project was born from the separate but intersecting evolutionary processes active in both civilization as a whole and in politics, economics, and religion specifically. Riding a wave of success economically through the Industrial Revolution, politically through increased levels of democracy, and religiously through the evangelical revivals, the British mind was up to the challenge of bringing poor benighted Africans out of darkness and into God's marvelous light. To study the Anglo-American appropriation of these threads, I used the denomination under which the Gomers served, the Church of the United Brethren in Christ, which was the first denomination born in America, not transplanted from Europe. And I'm going to skip it, but just to say that there was significant appropriation based on the literature coming out of that, the missionary literature of that denomination. But moving to the African-American appropriation, I now turn to the last context. I look first at the ways that the evolutionary threads of civilization and religion were appropriated within Black nationalism. I wish each of these individuals had their own episode of the American experience. I hope those presenters from last night are watching this. What amazing people. And by Black nationalism, I'm referring to an idea of nationhood or unity not formed by geography or language, but by race, thus Black nationalism. It was a response to slavery and the predicament of that African slaves found themselves in America. Black nationalism is the organized struggle of African Americans to obtain freedom, equality, and justice in America. Or if that proved impossible, a place like Liberia would do. The four major leaders are shown here. These leaders represent different models, sometimes very different models of Black nationalism. Despite the differences, however, and to varying degrees, they played according to the rules of civilization. While there are always exceptions, there were some general points of continuity. That Black people were backward and primitive and in need of improvement. accepting racial stereotypes that portray dark-skinned people as feminine and artistic, agreeing with the judgment that they were at least partially to blame for this state of affairs. Some even believed that God's hand could be seen even in slavery by bringing them to America in order to be civilized. And they bought into the technocratic myth, quote, the belief that the problems of African assimilation into American life could be solved simply by equipping the Blacks with skills necessary to the larger society, unquote, from Moses. Hence the impetus behind Hampton and Tuskegee Institutes to teach the Black man about thrift, work, and wealth and give him a marketable skill. Others promoted more classical education for Blacks, but the end result was the same. A Black elite would lead the people up from slavery. To see how African Americans appropriated aspects of religion from its white, British, and Anglo-American counterparts, I looked at African American missionaries, specifically AME missionaries in South Africa. These missionaries were brokers between white America and Black Africa. And Africans and African Americans were, quote, two culturally distinct peoples who happened to have a common racial identity, unquote. Their cultures differed so vastly that Africans often referred to African American missionaries as white men. They soon recognized that any similarity was usually skin deep, and that these Black missionaries were just as much the avatars of modernity, from Campbell, and representatives of Western culture, from Williams, as the white missionaries. African-American missionaries took on the white man's burden in their service to Africa, playing an intermediary role that had them looking up at white people and looking down on Africans. As for the Gomers themselves, I have time for but one example. This is what Gomer wrote in 1880, and I won't read it for you. Of interest here is the summation of the uncivilized state as consisting of poverty and wretchedness. Poverty indicates here a lack of material culture, a subsistence economy long surpassed in Europe and America. But there is also a lack of religious culture, with African traditional religion and its paraphernalia depicted as wretchedness. This is primitive culture, the dominion of Satan, and Gomer was there to help guide its evolution physically and spiritually toward Western forms, the dominion of God. Gomer was not highly educated. In comparison to the Black leaders described earlier, he hardly fits in the same conversation. But this is just the point of this paper, that the Victorian Missionary Project, through such leaders, was passed down even to the humblest African-American missionaries such as Gomer. Thank you.
Thank you, Dave. Okay, our panelists have all been great about time, so we have some time for questions, and I think I will kick it off by asking any of you about something. Christina, you touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious about sources and sort of where you've found to be the most fruitful places to do research. You know, maybe it's just at this point, my desire to travel after being cooped up for so long, but we can dream, you know, about what's coming. But both domestically, you know, where can people find sources for such things in the US? And then what are some other types of places in the field maybe that you found especially productive? I don't know who wants to take it on. Christina?
Yeah. Well, I can go since you mentioned me. I mean, most of what I know about Stuart comes directly from the Christian Recorder, right? But I think what I'm trying to push people towards is to think about the when you get a name, right? And if these names come from abroad, right, then it's likely that that they're mentioned locally, right? And so with that, most of my research has been in the Dominican Republic, in the National Archive, right? And there I have found diplomatic records that make, you know, connections to the AME Church, lawsuits. There's a number of lawsuits in terms of property, lawsuits that take place with the St. Thomas Church that I mentioned, Reverend Miller, right? Some of the colonial archives too, right? Then that ends up there. And so I think that there's actually sources that people are not looking at because we wouldn't know to look there unless you go to the Christian Recorder and you see a name and then you trace that back, right? So it's a lot more digging. But for example, there's this one minister, a local preacher in the Santo Domingo AME Church, Charles H. Williams, whose name doesn't really show up in Santo Domingo in the capital proper. But when I went to San Pedro Macorís, which is a town about an hour away to the east, there I was talking with somebody who's very familiar with the Ayuntamiento records, and his name shows up there petitioning permission, asking for permission to begin an AME church there. And so these sorts of local kind of digging, records that where I was able to find and piece together some of the networks.
Thanks.
One thing I'll share is that the missionary biography for Gomer doesn't care much about his pre-field life. And so I had very little to go on. And I found genealogical methodology to be very, very, very helpful in verifying, number one, small little things that are mentioned in a book somewhere, but also family connections. I found out that his brother served in the famous 54th Massachusetts Infantry. His niece was the wife of W.E.B. Du Bois. Very interesting facts related to his family. And I found out that FamilySearch.org, after 3 days, their digitization process surpasses the entire print collection of the Library of Congress, which when I read that quote was 26 million books. And they're doing that in 3 days. So that there is a lot of information being digitized every single day.
That's great. Thanks. Kim?
For my online portion of the research, I found it very useful to use the HBCU newspapers through Hathi Trust. The Fisk University student newspaper, at least some of the issues are digitized for the 1920s. And yeah, if I had just done a regular search for the specific names of my missionaries, the Edmistons, I probably would not have found it. But knowing that I could go through their alumni networks helped me find their letters from the field back to their alma maters. And this one was not exactly digitized, but it's part of that genealogical connection that Dave mentioned. So someone created a family tree for the white Edmiston family, the Edmistons of Tennessee who previously claimed ownership of the Edmistons that I study. And through that family tree, I found the title of a book that was the only real source for finding out about Alonzo Edmiston's early life before going to seminary, before entering Congo, and about his own family tree back to his grandmother. So yeah, now I can happily recommend that. Try to find the white relatives of your African-American missionaries.
That's great. Okay. We have a question in the Q&A. This is from Paul Harris. He says, I've been researching and writing about Alexander Campfor, an African-American missionary of the Methodist Episcopal Church. As the head of the College of West Africa, Campfor sought to make racial uplift from the US a force in Liberia. But Americo-Liberians were put off by what struck them as arrogance because they thought of themselves as civilized compared to the natives. Campfor became convinced that taking his mission to the natives was his only path forward. I'm wondering if this resonates with any of your research. I wrote a little bit about Campfor actually in the book that you cited of mine, Kim, where I sort of talk about these issues of struggles between Africans who saw these African Americans not as African, not as descendants or brothers and sisters, but in fact as Americans. And that sort of dissonance over identity became a really, I think, powerful force in missions fields. Yeah, Christina.
I could also speak to that. I think that Haiti, Dominican Republic has an interesting, parallel history where a lot of the people who are affiliated or become African Methodist in the later part of the 19th century are descendants of immigrants, people who were originally African American, went down during slavery, right? And when the missionaries come, right, post the Civil War, they often are coming with the idea of civilizing Haitians and Dominicans, but they end up, right, finding these communities of descendants of African Americans who, feel offended, to be frank, right, or want to collaborate with them, but that causes tensions because African Americans see their church properties as theirs, right, as part of the AME Church, and they haven't been around for the past, 40, 50 years. And so I do think that some of those tensions are really important to bring out, as well as what are the perspectives that have been grown, right, I would say locally or from, the people who are no longer immigrants or no longer African Americans, but are actually citizens of these other countries.
Mm-hmm. Great.
I saw a similar pattern happening in the American Presbyterian Congo Mission, especially the late 1920s to the 1930s. But my example isn't about whether African Americans considered the people they met on the African continent to be suitably civilized or not. It was that first generation of African pastors and evangelists who were gaining leadership authority through what was going to become the Presbyterian Church of Congo. As they were expanding their authority, they were starting to make increasingly effective arguments that their leadership mattered because they were respected on a higher level than the African American missionaries were. So based on their direct exposure to training by white missionaries, they argued that they should have additional say in how the mission operated, in how the church would function, and that they could exercise that authority by vetoing the decisions of Black missionaries like the Edmonstons.
Really interesting. Anthea Butler has a question. She says, I'd like to hear you all talk about the destruction of sources and the ways in which the archives can shape the stories.
Well, I'll just say really briefly, I've seen a couple references in endnotes to the Gomer papers, but I cannot find them. So it's just to say, yeah, that's a real question. Kind of heartbreaking when it happens. So I'm very interested in in the answer to this question, because I'm dealing with it in my own research.
I know many years ago when I was sort of working on some of this stuff, that was the pre-digitization days, doing some work and sending a graduate student to do some work down at Livingstone College in North Carolina. And basically they were so strapped for money. This is an AMEZ school. And they were so strapped for money that they had a lot of stuff in boxes. They didn't need, so he was sort of digging through boxes, but I thought, gosh, how much of that just, never, was sort of disintegrated before anyone even had a chance to look at it, until they either had the wherewithal or the digitization capabilities to get some of that, you know, onto in other forms. But it's a real problem. Anyone else want to say more?
I did most of my early research through Talladega College, which thankfully managed to avoid the possibility of destruction of the documents most relevant to this work, because family members had photographed each page of Mr. Edmiston's journal to make it into a microfilm version. But the trick was finding the boxes of microfilm, which became increasingly difficult when funding lapsed and they were unable to keep an archivist.
Interesting. Anthea also put something else in for Wendy. She thanks you, Wendy, for bringing up Phelps-Stokes. She said, that is the white whale I've been chasing for information since my first book. You want to say any more about Phelps-Stokes?
No, I want to learn more about it. You can read the whole Phelps-Stokes report online. I'm sure most of you know that. And I've heard some interesting work on James Agri, who was on the Phelps-Stokes Fund's big tour of Africa. He's Ghanaian, educated in the US. But I want to learn more. So I'm afraid I don't have much more to add, except that I think that I need to do a better job helping students understand what it was, because it's so influential in the schools. In even a course on schooling, they had such a huge impact on schooling and educational policy all through British Africa.
Can I be the disembodied voice here for a minute and
Yeah.
respond to this, because it's actually kind of important. You know, I ran across Phelps-Stokes because they had given money for the first book I did for Church of God in Christ. They had given money, and they were also bringing people over to go to Saints Industrial School in the 30s. And so this was really interesting because I could find some things, and I think some of it, I'm going to reveal a source now, which I hate, but I'm going to do, is, and Laurie's laughing because she knows how I am. Some of this is at Yale. And I haven't been in there to get in there because of the pandemic. I was going to go in and really go and look. But it's really key in terms of thinking about this back and forth movement of missionaries. And I think the other part, which I mean, I really enjoyed this panel. And now you can see that I was the selfish person who wanted this panel in the first place, because this is all crossing some of the work that I do. Part of it is about the ways in which we have to think about not just foreign missions, but foreign missions in concert with home missions, and how these things happen. So I'm listening to, you know, looking online, because, you know, Spellman's papers are online. That has been really useful for me, but it also chronicles people going back and forth. Phelps-Stokes, the same thing. You know, Hampton has some stuff, but of course they don't have the kind of archival situation that they need to have there. So I think when we're trying to do this work, we can't talk about it out. The reason why I asked that question is because I wanted to bring up the sense of which we have to talk about the loss of sources for these kinds of records, because we cannot talk about what we find unless we talk about what is being lost and the kinds of ways in which we need to think about this. So one of the things I'm hoping with this grant that I have with Judith and Lerone is that we can think about some of this stuff. We can't reclaim everything, but I think it's really important that when you do go someplace, and this is not just to the panel, you already know this, but to everybody out there, when you do go someplace and you find something and it's not being taken care of very well, you know, try to help encourage them to write a small NEH grant or something like that, so that you're able to preserve these materials, because it's really very difficult to do this work. But some of the things that are coming online now are really good, and I think are going to help us in this endeavor to find out about African Americans who go on missions. So thank you for letting me be disembodied, and go back to discussion.
That's a great point, Anthea, and really an important one for what's not there. Yeah, Christina.
I just want to piggyback on that and say that it's also about knowing where things are and having inventories that are not just for particular archives, but are, you know, shared inventories. What I'm imagining here, and why I say this based off of my own research, is, you know, I spent a good amount of time at the Schomburg, but then I was like having to shuffle across town to Burke Library, right? Because one issue is here versus, that for the Voice of Missions, and just having a comprehensive list of where things are would be really helpful. And I think that that's something that we could do as scholars who study missions, is to just kind of help each other out with that, or even put that online, because I don't know, I wasn't told where to go look. I had to find that for myself.
Mm-hmm. Other comments about that? Yeah, Anthea is suggesting a Google Doc to start would be a great resource for a lot of us. I know it's really hard to find. I love the idea. Kim, was it you who mentioned sort of looking at white relatives? Boy, that is a great suggestion.
They were very proud to be kinship connected to a missionary.
Interesting.
So they collected so much information.
Huh. Yeah, that's interesting that they claimed them at all, but yeah.
No, not just claiming, they were proud of it.
Yeah. Huh. Do any of the panelists have questions for each other or comments about each other's comments?
I have a comment about Christina's work. I was thinking how important it can be for helping us speak to these common ideas of the Black church as being static, timeless, and only really important in the Deep South. Your work gives us so many angles to question that stereotype, to think about the development of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and how its leaders, its congregations could look differently in terms of geography, but also in terms of approach, how the connections between the Caribbean and African congregations could be different than those between those in the US and on the African continent. So thank you.
Well, thank you. Completely humbled, just like that's, I think I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation, because there's a lot of great ways that we could push this, right? And I'm really excited about the possibilities of African-American missions work along those lines. So I thank you, Kim, for pointing that out.
Sounds like the start of a great new movement with a Google Doc and maybe other ways to connect. Yeah, Dave.
Just a thought. There is a impressive, I think it's called the National African American Mission Conference, that happens every year now, somewhere out there on the East Coast. And I'm sure that organization would also be quite interested in this kind of research. So they've been doing a really good job, I think, about the last 10 years. And I noticed there was just an article in Christianity Today about the African American mission movement. And that is not a common article in Christianity Today.
Interesting.
Thanks for mentioning that. I want to look it up.
Yeah, that's a great idea. We are just about at time. Kim, you are the one that brought us all together. I don't know if you want to say any final word. I appreciate being involved in this, and I've really enjoyed hearing what everyone has to say, but I'm going to turn it over to Kim to close us out.
This topic is close to my heart, because I know how many decades our scholarly ancestors worked to help bring more visibility to this field, and to publish articles and book chapters, edited volumes that would provide us with timelines, names, sources, so that we could get to the place where there'd be various scholars taking different angles on studying African American missionaries. So I thank you for helping me to celebrate the work that our forebears did, and for helping me push it forward, and to help get more people interested in joining us.
Great, thank you. Well, that said, may the weekend begin. Thanks all for coming.